Hey, this is Jonesy from Jones Your TV coming at you with a review for The Man in High Castle Season 2, Episode 2, Number 2, The Road Less Traveled. This episode, we got to see a lot of action, a lot of character development, and it was a phenomenal episode. So here's my review slash recap. So in this episode, we got to see Frank and Robert and Ed all had to deal with the Yakuza, and we see Frank and Arnold basically, or Frank rather, and Robert strike a deal with the Yakuza. Basically, they're going to make false items and sell them to rich Japanese people to give this extra money to the Yakuza, and they will do this as long as Ed is released and as long as Ed is no longer put on death row, basically for killing the crown prince. So that works out. The Yakuza makes the deal, and we see this powerful scene in which Inspector Kido comes in and he's talking to Ed and basically tells Ed if he doesn't accept this pardon and doesn't avoid signing basically the release forms for him being guilty, he will kill everybody who's close to Ed. So there's this powerful scene. We basically see Ed at his lowest point after all this torture, um, and it's very sad and depressing. But in the end of the episode, we get in on a positive note because we see Ed freed, and now these three men must make those large payments weekly, and so we see that plot be developed. We also got to see a certain scene where Frank had this nightmare and he went insane when he was in the cell with Robert, and it was a very compelling scene as well. But it is interesting as you watch later in the season to see how the Frank, Robert, and Ed dynamic shifts and changes. But it was great in this episode just to see them strike that deal with the Yakuza and see that scene with Ed. So Tagomi in this episode, he has a disagreement with the general on moving the uranium because the general wants to move the uranium via the buses with people on them. He doesn't really care about American lives, but Tagomi, he cares about everybody's life. So basically he has this disagreement with the general, and he basically tells his assistant to go behind the general's back and change the plans and move the uranium via trucks. This will play a larger part in the later episodes as well. Tagami also, he visits the library to read these forbidden books, basically these American books that were written before the war, so he could sort of gain some knowledge. And it was interesting to see Tagami sort of seeking this out, and it is interesting to see his arc this season when it comes to basically the visions and all the certain things he's been doing. Joe Blake in this episode, he gets a simple construction job, and he has a falling out with his girlfriend Rita because Rita knows something's up. Rita knew that he wasn't really fully devoted to her, of course, because he's always thinking about Juliana, and so they have a falling out. And there's actually this really amazing scene where Joe is reading to his kid, or Rita's child, about Huckleberry Finn, and they're talking about Huck's friend, and he said basically Rita's daughter or Rita's son says, how can he do something good? He's black. And then Rita of course said, well, yeah, that makes sense. And John, you see John's face because John's a good guy and he knows this is wrong. And basically, it's one of those scenes. The Man in High Castle thrives off scenes that make you go like, wow, that's insane. This world's very dark, twisted, and people's minds have been so brainwashed to think that these things are okay. And that was one of those scenes when Joe was reading to him. And also we see John come and he convinces Joe that he needs to go back to Berlin to see his father. And they have some very compelling scenes and back to back with each other this episode too. So speaking of John, he has a discussion with his wife Helen about how the Fuhrer is feeble and how he's ailing in this episode. And it's very interesting to see John talk like this because John always talks about the glory of the Reich and how he should serve Germany to his fullest abilities. But you see him talking about the Fuhrer, and it's basically the scene where he's basically saying Hitler's sick and ill. But in the end, he also says, no matter what happens with Hitler, I'm still going to be loyal to the Reich, and all, basically says, I will find the man in the high castle. So we get to see that too. Joe sort of at this weird point with his wife. Really, the most compelling storyline of them all was Juliana's. So after she was attempted to be of course, the resistance fighters attempted to murder her last episode. She's picked up by this farmer, and they have this scene with her and the farmer in the truck where he's talking about the fight with the Japanese that went up all the way to the end of the war, and he tells the horrible stories of how the Japanese just blatantly murdered the innocents at the end of the war, and how terrible it was, and how he was glad that he was fighting or she was a resistance fighter fighting against them. Juliana, he drives her back to the city, and Juliana tells her parents to leave town because he figures out that uh, and at the same time, before that happens, before he tells Arnold and his mom to leave town, he basically figures out that the man he's been looking for, the man who's in the High Castle tape, is named George Dixon, and she needs to find him in New York because he can prevent the nuclear bomb from dropping. And this episode ends with one of the best cliffhangers of the series so far. I mean, 7 episodes in, and yet it's still one of the best cliffhangers. And that is Juliana basically is crossing the border, and everybody who's on the Japanese side and everybody who's on the German side is pointing guns at her, telling her, hey, you need to stop, you need to stop. But she goes on the line of the border and says, I'm requesting asylum in Nazi, or in the Reich. And it's this very intense scene, and it just cuts to black after she's on the line of the border and everybody's pointing guns at her. So it's a very intense way to the end of the episode. And of course, we know Juliana is going to New York to find this George Dixon, and that'll be a cool plot line we see later on. But it was just a cool way to end this episode with her crossing the border and everybody pointing guns at her and yelling at her and not knowing if she was going to survive or not. So this episode in the end, the road less traveled in the end, had some great scenes. Of course, the show thrives in great scenes. The Ed and Kido scene was amazing. Whenever the farmer was talking to Juliana in the truck, that was a very compelling scene as well. I love how this episode proves that Tagomi is still a good person. That despite all the horrors going on around him, he doesn't want innocents to die. And I love that cliffhanger at the border with Juliana. It was just phenomenal. So I guess I had to give the final score, my final score for The Road Less Traveled would have to be a 9.4 out of 10 because it was one of the best episodes of The Man in the High Castle to date, and definitely one of the best episodes this season.